that divine emotion, the only emotion that God has in the story is grief. It's pain, literally pain to his heart. There's no reference to divine wrath. Now, there is a statement that God says, he looked at the earth, behold, it was ruined, and therefore I will ruin the earth. So you do have to deal with, well, what do you do with that statement?
Yeah.
And the way I talk about it in the book is that it's analogous to a potter who is spinning clay on a wheel. Have you ever spun clay before?
I haven't, but I've watched it. I've even watched a sermon where the entire time the guy was spinning it on the wheel as he was preaching.
Wow. Okay.
That was the thing they did back in the 90s. So
okay, yeah. I mean, it's a classic sermon illustration, and then of course it shows up in the Bible.
Right.
So imagine spinning this pot, and you look down, and it's full of air bubbles, and like pieces are flapping all over, and there are holes in it. If you want to make that, bowl or whatever it is you're making, you have to return it to useful formlessness in order to remake it. That's a precondition. So you can't just sort of patch it up because it will explode in the kiln.
Right.
So I think it's similar. Like that act of destruction on God's part is the returning of creation back to useful formlessness so that he can remake it. And it's important to note that I think, my take on the Genesis 6 to 9 or 6 to 8 segment is that this is engaging with popular flood stories. This is not a one-for-one historical event, probably rooted in local flooding events in Mesopotamia, but not straightforwardly historical. But it's retelling those known cultural flood stories within a monotheistic framework.
Okay.
And so, whereas typically you would have the protagonist God and the antagonist God sends the flood, the protagonist tells the hero to build a boat and preserve his family and animals, which happens in several other flood stories. In Genesis, it says that the antagonist is violence. Yahweh is still the protagonist, but the antagonist is violence. That's the thing that ruins the earth. And so God then does this act of, he saves humanity in a microcosm of creation in the ark.
Yeah.
So I think that's how the story wants us to read it, as God's life-saving endeavor. And I talk in the book about, kids' depictions in like kids' Bibles and flannel graphs of the flood, where you have like Noah and his family happy in the ark. And I sort of joke about it at first, right? Because it misses all the violence.
Right.
But I do think in the end, that is the image the story wants us to walk away with.
Yeah.
About like who God is. God is the God who preserves creation and is doggedly committed to it.
Yeah, no, that's really helpful. Okay, so it's obvious to you and to me, because we spent some time in biblical studies, and you even more so, obviously, with me in the Old Testament. We're familiar with the ancient Near Eastern culture a little bit, and we're familiar with the source critical treatment of the Old Testament. So the idea that actually the flood story is probably a combination of flood traditions that have been brought together in the Bible. And it seems pretty obvious to us that Genesis is responding to these traditions to make the kind of theological points that you'd make. What would be a couple things you might say to people who haven't really thought through that much, and maybe even be a little bit alarmed to hear that, this isn't just kind of like straightforward historical reporting?
Yeah, a couple things I'd say. One is what I'm saying about the flood story is a genre statement. Like when we read poetry, we have different expectations of its accuracy than when we're reading a science report, right? So we allow poetry to say certain things that are not literally true, but are true in some other sense. And we allow this when it comes to literature. So when Jesus says a man went down to Jericho and tells the story of the Good Samaritan, the truth of that story doesn't hang on that story actually having happened. We allow for this non-literal non-historically literal story to say something true about what God calls us to in the world, who God is, etc.
Mm-hmm.
And so same with the flood story. So I'm making a genre designation,
Mm-hmm.
and I'm happy for people to dispute that and see it differently. But my own perspective is that this is engaging a popular story or parable from the ancient world, a founding story. Some people
Mm-hmm.
call them myths, but that can be pretty loaded.
Right.
And recasting it to say something true about the character of God and about the nature of the world.
Yeah.
And so that's important. I would also say to try to avoid a sort of domino effect or house of cards approach to the question where you think that, well, if that's not historically literal, then what about the resurrection?
Right.
Right. Because I think that's where people often go mentally. Like, if I can't trust that, then
Yeah.
what can I trust?
I
Well,
think there's a big Ark replica somewhere in the middle of the country,
yeah,
maybe, that's kind of predicated on this whole thing, right?
exactly. Yeah, yeah. It just, if they just saw genre differently, I think the whole need for that would go away. But um, many jobs would be lost, so we don't want
Right.
that.
It does create jobs, I suppose. Right?
um, and so yeah, I think avoid that house of cards domino effect where like this doesn't take out the resurrection. The resurrection is a different kind of historical claim,
Mhm.
um, and so I don't feel like it threatens that. And then also, like, I've used an art analogy before of like thinking of genres as artistic, like different artistic styles. And
Mhm.
so if you look at a realism painting, there are texts in the Old Testament that are closer to realism,
Mm.
like the Samuel narratives or something like that. Um, and then there are stories that are more impressionistic.
Mhm.
And impressionism is not like, if you think of Monet's water lilies, it's not like you look at those and say, ah, too bad I don't have a photograph of those lilies, because that
Right.
would be clearer, it would be more realistic, it would be more accurate. No, you look at those and say, wow, what Monet is capturing something about the experience of encountering and moving out into nature, um, that you can't capture with a photograph.
Mhm.
And
Mhm.
so using a different artistic genre, like you could say myth recasting in
Right.
Genesis 6 to 8, says something that couldn't be said otherwise.
Yeah.
And so it's a movement toward truth to recognize that genre and then try to understand it on its own terms.
Yeah. Yeah. That's really helpful.
Thanks so much for watching this video. If you enjoyed it, please make sure you subscribe using the link below and check out some more of our videos.